Well, speaking of long arms, the long arms of Beijing.
Well done.
Thank you. It's a good segment. That's why
I'm
the host. So, the Biden administration talks a lot about working with U.S. allies to counter China. But the question is, are U.S. allies interested in that?
So that's a good question. And that's why they pay you the big bucks. 2 cups you get a week instead of just one.
Filled with water.
It depends on which part of the world. And it depends on how much backing they're getting from D.C. in order to do it, and how much awareness there is of the challenge. So if you're looking at the Indo-Pacific, one area that we've talked about before, and that's worth talking about again, is the Pacific Islands part of it. And you had Premier Daniel Soudani on a little while ago. It was a great interview, and it showed exactly what the problem is. He's the sort of leader that we hope for in the region. He's democratic, he's honest, he's standing up for his people, and he's not getting the backing that he needs from our primary allies in the area, which would be Australia and New Zealand, or even from the U.S.
And just for context, he's very against the Chinese Communist Party's influence in the Solomon Islands.
Yeah, his situation is the litmus test, I would say, for reactions in the region to China. So one of the things that China does in order to consolidate its position is to make sure other countries de-recognize Taiwan. That's a big priority. So that
Which the Solomon Islands did.
Which the Solomon Islands did for 36 years. Mm-hmm. They had a very good relationship with Taiwan. And they need the de-recognition of Taiwan so that when the invasion of Taiwan happens, it doesn't have any of the diplomatic support.
When it happens? Not if it happens?
So this is the Beijing calculation. So talking from the point of view of how China thinks, first you isolate the country, and then it's easier to take it over. So every country with which it has relationships bolsters Taiwan to a certain degree. So it's often presented in the media as something that's kind of almost funny or whatever, this guy paid this much and this guy paid this much. So they flip back and forth, and isn't this amusing? But it actually has very deep strategic implications.
Like even when it's a small country, like what's left, Nicaragua, Eswatini.
The
Vatican.
Yeah, and we'll see how long the Vatican.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean that one's coming down.
That's
quickly,
shaky.
Yeah. And a lot of the remaining ones are in the Pacific Islands. So they are affiliated with the U.S. Two of the 3 U.S. freely associated states, we could talk about what those are, still recognize Taiwan. And that has implications for flight paths and intelligence sharing and U.S. ability to base in those regions. It's not a minor thing. So the Solomons recognized Taiwan until 2019, and it flipped in 2019 to China, in a kind of a surprising way. And I think we were caught off guard here, sort of in North America, because we had assumed Australia and New Zealand were on top of it, especially Australia, primary area of responsibility from a Five Eyes perspective. Soon after Solomon's flipped, Kiribati flipped, and these are locations. World War II. This was the site of the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomons. This is Macon and Tarawa and Kiribati. These are highly strategic locations. And so having them fall more under Chinese influence is incredibly problematic from a strategic perspective. That's why we have this Five Eyes architecture where Australia and New Zealand are supposed to be taking a look at the area on our behalf.
They're sort of the ones in charge of the Pacific.
So,
supposedly.
Yeah, I mean, these are all post-World War II semi-colonial constructs, but there is a physical reality to it, which is the cables which are transmitting all the information in and out of the countries physically land in these countries. So you can have signals intelligence that are based there that theoretically gives you access to what's going on in the countries. Before it was satellite, but now it's more the cables. And they also position themselves as the lead on the analysis of the region for partners, and not just the Five Eyes. So when there was a coup in Fiji, and the Indians wanted to know what to do, they were talking to people in Australia and relying on the advice of the Australians, which was not great advice. So they're kind of have been the entry point for non-Soviet bloc, non-Chinese countries' analysis into the region. And under their watch, we've seen country after country flip to Taiwan. We've seen huge BRI projects. We've seen ports getting developed. So the zone has been drifting towards China. And the Solomons is a very good example of that.
Well, I think what's really interesting is, I asked you about the Biden administration saying it's going to work with U.S. allies. And I think a lot of people, when they hear that, think, oh, America's European allies. I don't know what the Biden administration means if they're thinking from this Eurocentric world.
They came out with this whole, the sanctions against the China for the Uyghurs, right, situation
Using
was
mostly,
with Europe, right?
Yeah. And you come out and say, the most important things are, these tiny little islands in the Pacific. India, who cares? Why are they more important than European allies?
So this is the difference. The 20th century was very much the Atlantic century. So the strategic focus was the Atlantic, the U-boats and, the sort of the positioning in the Caribbean and all that sort of that. It was the Atlantic century. That was where the trade was. The trade was between the Americas and Europe. The 21st century is the Indo-Pacific century. Most of the thriving economies are in the Indo-Pacific region, and the securing of the sea lanes has to be in that area. That's why the free and open Indo-Pacific is essential. And China, right? I mean, clearly. Yeah. So, we're not, the big threat and the big gain is all in the Indo-Pacific zone. So there's a question about what role the Europe plays. And the problem with the EU is it's only as good as its weakest member in terms of policy on China. So, they buy off.
Sorry.
I honestly
Get something
couldn't.
stuck in your throat.
I couldn't hear the subtle beneath the.
Did you have grease stuck in your
Only-
throat?
No,
or
I think it was
That's pretty
Germany.
I had Germany stuck in my throat.
But
Oh.
no, it's also Greece and Italy. There's a lot.
Also, and France. I mean, let's not forget to blame the French.
So
Wow.
how long do you have? The French among all the Europeans are by far the most advanced on their Indo-Pacific policy because they have French territory in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean.
Mhm.
And they're kind of broke. And one of their main industries is weapons sales. And another main industry is energy. So both of those are potential growth areas in the Indo-Pacific. And they've been establishing relationships in the Indo-Pacific region for a very long time. The French-India relationship is very old and deep and strong. They've been doing space cooperation since the 50s and 60s.
Oh, wow. Well, so mainly what you're saying is Europe and European allies, the U.S. really is, they don't really have any connections or influence in the Indo-Pacific, which is where everything is happening.
So it's
Right now.
it's even more complicated than that. So going back to the French. So if you're looking at U.S.-India developing deeper relationships, you'd think Europe would theoretically want that. But actually, the French don't want that. Because if India and the U.S. get closer together, that's a reduction of the French role and potentially a reduction in French arms sales into India. Right? So there's a lot. So it's a very weird situation where actually the interests of China and Paris in some sectors may be aligned.
Wow. And so it would be, for France, it's more imperative that they have these weapon sales rather than the greater issue of containing the Chinese Communist Party.
France, the role of the government of France is doing what's best for the French people and the French economy.
Right.
Right.
And unlike us, the French can't print their own money. They can't just print trillions of dollars to spend on stuff. They're constrained, so they got to sell weapons.
Yeah, we're not on the baguette standard yet.
Yeah.
But they're very good at trying to find that niche. And we did this research project at Chatham House. And one of the things the French said was, we have lower conditionality, political and military conditionality when we do our deals, which means we'll sell better stuff to worse people than the Americans will.
Lower conditionality it's a great way of saying lower moral standards.
Yeah. I mean, that, and this is the issue, though, because it goes back to your first question about allies and goes to the Solomon Islands about moral standards, is we will go around talking about moral standards. But when you've got a guy like Daniel Suidani, who, when the Solomons switched to China, said, my province, Malaita province, wants to stay related to Taiwan because we believe in democracy. We don't believe in authoritarian governments. We're Christians. We think that China is, anti people of faith. And he really stood up for those values. And then he got sick and he needed help. And then where were our values then?
Specifically, he was diagnosed with brain cancer.
He was diagnosed with suspected something in the brain.
Okay.
So-
So potentially.
Yeah. And he needed a CAT scan. And his own government wouldn't wouldn't facilitate the treatment. And this is an interesting component of the exporting of China's social credit system, right? Because basically it was Chinese government pressure on their proxy government in the Solomon Islands to say, you don't back up the CCP, you don't get healthcare, right? So it's an indication of things to come. This one little case, the Solomon Islands case, if you start pulling at the threads, it shows you a lot of things, not about just about us or about the allies, but about how the Chinese operate and about what's going to happen to people if you don't back them up.
And as you were saying, the West was not there for Sudani in health-wise. Like the U.S. obviously didn't do anything, but neither did Australia or New Zealand.
So the New Zealanders, nothing, like nothing. There hasn't been any coverage, nothing. Somebody came after me on Twitter to try to discredit my coverage. That's all we've heard out of the New Zealand strategic community. A mild Twitter backstabbing. That's what we heard from New Zealand.
Awesome.
Yeah. The Australians, to their credit, and this is what gives hope, is there were elements in the Australian system that were appalled that their own government didn't back him up. So there was an article in the Australian, Sky News did an interview with him.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah. So trying to say, we have to help people like this. Because one thing is this values argument. The other is the strategic argument. You don't fight it in the Solomons, it's going to move closer to you and you're going to fight it in your own country next.
Well, it's like the Philippines, when the U.S. back in 2012, I think it was, didn't do anything when the Chinese essentially occupied Scarborough Shoal. That sent shockwaves throughout the region saying that, the U.S. will not back you against China. And so that, radically shifted the calculation for a lot of countries that, the U.S. isn't going to help us. We have to make nice with China. And so this Solomon Island situation is a similar thing.
It's very much so. I mean, if we're going around running these democracy education projects in these countries, and they say, okay, if I stand up for democracy and if I stand up to the Chinese, am I going to end up like Daniel Soudani, where I'm going to be left to die if I get sick? Because you're not going to back me up. Like it's such an interesting case where we're so clearly being called out for being hypocrites. New Zealand will spend tens of millions of dollars in the region, ostensibly to train people to be honest, democratic, accountable leaders. And here they've got one for free, right? And he needs a little bit of help and crickets, right?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And he did ultimately, it was Taiwan that actually helped him out and had him over for the CAT scan.
Even more interesting than that, it was Taiwan, but the way that he got into Taiwan was an Indian strategist, heard about the situation. And Professor M.D. Nalapat from Manipal University. And he said, this is a democratic, brave man of principle who we recognize from the Indian perspective, because we're also trying to stand up to China, as somebody who is on the front line of this fight, just like we are. And he had hosted President Tsai when she was Dr. Tsai to come to his university. And so he knew he had access to the president's office, and he called the president's office, and that was how it happened. So again, this was countries that we don't normally put front and center in terms of alliances they are pragmatically, but in terms of our rhetoric, standing up for the values that we should be standing up for and creating a situation that is the right thing to do.
Yeah, no one in the U.S., when they hear America's allies, they don't think India.
And they wouldn't think India is a back channel to Taiwan.
Yeah, no.